I'm here at the Hit Factory in Miami to meet with one of the top hip-hop producers in the world. He's worked with artists from Beyoncé, Fat Joe, Christina Aguilera, and the list goes on and on. His name, Scott Storch.
My monthly overhead for my household and household employees was somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million a month I was spending.
We'd all love to be millionaires, and there's a lot of ways to achieve that. Let's face it, some are better than others. I think we'd all agree the music industry has got to be one of the best ways to get rich. That's exactly what Scott Storch did. He was literally living the dream, but he's filed for bankruptcy twice. You've got to wonder, what went wrong, right? Well, this is the story of how Scott Storch went from multi-millionaire record producer to flat broke. Scott Storch's life is a bit of a mystery, dating back to day one. For a long time, people believed he was born on December 16, 1973 in Canada, but that turned out to be a lie, probably. It now looks like he was actually born in Long Island, New York, to Joyce Yolanda, who went by the stage name Joyce Carroll when performing for Cameo Parkway Records. But it wasn't just Scott's mom who proved there was music in his blood. His father was a court reporter named Phil, who sang with a street corner doo-wop group in his spare time. His uncle on his dad's side was also a famous musician named Jerry Storch. He founded the soul rock band The Vagrants and also wrote songs for other musicians. Further back on his mom's side, Scott's great-great-grandfather, Mayer Machtenberg, was a famous Lithuanian composer in the early 1900s. So Scott had strong musical genes from both sides of his family. In fact, the genes are so strong that Scott's older brother also went on to become a musician. But unlike Scott, he chose to found an alt-rock band and support his art by working as a pizza delivery boy. Despite his interesting family, Scott's childhood wasn't perfect. He spent some of his childhood in South Florida. When he was 8, he was injured during a soccer game, and his mom became terrified of letting him play sports. She admits she was a little overprotective with Scott, but it might have been a good thing because she decided he should start piano lessons to fill the gap left by a lack of sports. Those lessons would become seriously valuable to Scott 10 years later. His mom even quit singing during the week so Scott could attend piano lessons with his old jazz musician teacher, and she got the cash together to buy him his very own baby grand piano. Just 2 years after the soccer accident, his parents divorced when he was 10 years old. Amazingly, Scott seemed to take it pretty well, focusing on his piano lessons while living with his mom. It's no surprise he was pretty good, but it's still impressive that he was getting paid to play at only 12 years old. A few years later, halfway through his freshman year at high school, Scott left his mom and moved to his dad's house in Pennsylvania. His mom didn't realize at the time, but the only reason he left was that he hated her new boyfriend. This choice might have been what led to all Scott's problems later. Scott's dad had a gambling problem and a love of fast cars that he couldn't always afford. He used to take Scott down to the car dealerships when he was a little kid, and this had a huge influence on Scott, especially once his dad wasn't in his life so much, and he wanted to impress him whenever he got the opportunity. Scott went to high school in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. He arrived on his first day at his new school in his dad's Porsche. That was about as much as he got from his dad, who never really parented him. Eventually, he left Scott on his own and moved to New York. Scott spent his time playing the piano, which his mom had shipped to him. Scott never showed up to school for his sophomore year, but a chance meeting meant he soon rekindled his relationship with a girl he'd been dating at the school the year before. When she was just 17 years old, she became pregnant with Scott's baby. But he never showed up to the hospital, and she'd only see him again 11 years later. Instead of going to school or raising a child, Scott started to make a name for himself in the music industry. He joined hip-hop group The Roots, taking on the role of the keyboard player. But he was more than that, becoming the brains of the band. He would be hugely influential, making a mark on their next 2 albums. The only problem was, he wasn't really into touring. So, when he was offered $10,000 by Rough House Records if he joined a new conceptual hip-hop soul-pop trio, he took it and quit The Roots. His new band never even made an album, but it gave him the opportunity to experiment. Things really started to change for Scott when, at the age of 25, he was introduced to Dr. Dre. The two obviously hit it off because it wasn't long before Scott was moving to LA to produce the tracks on Dr. Dre's upcoming album, Chronic 2001. He had a hand in a lot of tracks on that album, but composing the piano symphony on the iconic Still DRE was the moment that Scott turned himself into a rising star of hip-hop production. Now, everyone wanted him. His next project was a partnership with Timbaland, co-writing the Justin Timberlake smash hit, Cry Me a River. Two huge hits in a row is a surefire way to cement yourself in the music industry, and that's exactly what Scott had just done. He was now only 26 years old, but was living life as a millionaire record producer. You'd think he'd have at least 1 year where he just lived the dream, but instead, as soon as the money started flowing in, so did the problems. That same year, he was sued by the very fancy West Hollywood Le Morose Suite Hotel for $3,000 in unpaid bills. That was just the start of the problems. After that little bump in the road, Scott moved down to South Florida and started working on projects for his own company, Tough Jew Productions. To the public, it looked like life was on the right path for Scott. Glossy magazines were printing that Scott had actually moved back to South Florida to spend more time with his mom and granddad, and he even met his son that was born 11 years ago for the first time. Scott's high school girlfriend moved nearby so she could start forming a relationship with Scott. But in reality, that wasn't exactly true. Scott's meetings with his mom only happened 2 or 3 times a year. He'd send a car to pick her and his granddad up, and he'd meet them at expensive restaurants. He wouldn't even take off his sunglasses, as his bodyguards sat 1 chair away, making sure their family conversation wasn't private. He'd rush through these rare dinners, always claiming someone was waiting for him at the studio, while his mom begged him not to spend so much money on them. She knew he was burning through his cash, but he wouldn't listen. He claimed his image was the thing setting him apart from the competition. He was spending his days at the Miami Hit Factory, where he'd play his compositions on a piano backed by a group of session musicians. Unlike most hip-hop producers who performed to sample music that already existed, his unusual method seemed to be working. They were landing hit after hit. Beyoncé's Naughty Girl, 50 Cent's Candy Shop, and Chris Brown's Run It were all his work, and they were inescapable, sitting at #1 in the charts for months on end. By 2006, Scott was earning $100,000 per track, plus royalties. With at least 80 songs per year, Scott's net worth was estimated at between $70 and $100 million. The only problem was, he was spending it all. Remember I mentioned his dad gave him a love of expensive cars? Well, that was the first thing Scott started blowing his money on. He started collecting cars like they were playing cards, and soon he had a whopping 13 of them, including a $600,000 Mercedes SLR McLaren and the most expensive car available, a $1.7 million Bugatti Veyron.
Yeah, that's Scott Storch, yo.
Oh, snap. Who the hell is Scott Storch?
Yo, he's a dude that make all the beats and shit, yo.
But it wasn't just cars. Any luxury item you can imagine, he had to own. He paid $3 million for a pinky ring, complete with a diamond, which used to be owned by Michael Jackson. He paid $20 million for a 125-foot yacht. But his biggest purchase was also his worst decision yet. An 18,000 square foot mansion in Palm Island worth a whopping $10.5 million, which he called Villa Ferrari. It's worth mentioning that he made at least half of these purchases while high on different substances. This was also the year that Scott's second child was born. 3 months after that, he decided to take an extended vacation. He headed off to the south of France, but soon found himself in Hollywood. His main hobbies seemed to be partying and dating multiple high-profile stars, including Kim Kardashian, Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan, and the porn star Heather Hunt. which ensured the paparazzi were never far away. He wasn't with any of them for very long, but while he was dating them, he was also spending eye-watering amounts of cash on gifts and lavish activities for them. Paris Hilton alone received a shocking number of gifts, including a $2 million necklace, a Mercedes Maybach, and he even flew her out to the French Riviera in a private jet at the cost of over $250,000. Even after Scott's month in Hollywood, his drug habit seemed to have got the better of him. His manager admitted later that he initially allowed Scott to spin wildly without stopping him, but now it had all gone too far. He used to show up at Scott's Villa Ferrari to try to help get him clean from the drugs, but was shocked to discover that the inside of the mansion looked more like a crack house than a luxury pad. There was garbage everywhere, and the rest of the space was taken up by drugged-out hangers on who just wanted Scott's money. When Scott eventually left Janet Jackson sitting in the studio for hours because he didn't bother to show up on time, his manager knew he was in trouble. News travels fast in the music industry, and Scott's reputation had gone from the man who turned every record he touched into gold to a man who was totally unreliable. Nobody wanted to risk working with him anymore. Scott's manager finally left in 2007, but by that time, Scott's 6-month-long bender had seriously eaten into his finances. He'd somehow blown through a whopping $30 million in just 6 months. Scott started hiring himself out to whoever was willing to pay, producing terrible tracks for Paris Hilton, who was still his girlfriend at the time, and people like Jessica Simpson and Hulk Hogan's daughter. His worst decision yet was a flight to Moscow to perform with Russian rap R&B duo Timati and Knox, a gig which we bet Scott would have preferred hadn't made it onto YouTube. But it wasn't just his music career that was suffering. His financial and personal life was in the middle of an explosive downward spiral that no amount of payments for bad gigs was going to solve. Bills and lawsuits were piling up, and Scott couldn't get on top of them. In June 2008, he decided not to show up to a court hearing. He'd been accused of not sticking to his child support payments for his first son to the value of $5,000. Sure, that doesn't sound like a huge amount of cash, but it was causing huge problems behind the scenes for Scott's high school sweetheart. She couldn't afford school fees for her honor student son and was having to beg the academy not to throw him out. She'd also been evicted from her apartment after Scott failed to pay her rent, something he'd promised her he'd do. Her and Scott's son were now crashing on the couch in her parents' house. That wasn't the only son he was neglecting. His 8-month-old baby had already lost his health insurance because Scott had missed payments. Failing to show up to the court case meant he was now dodging the court officers who kept showing up to serve him with contempt papers. He even once had one of his people threateningly drive a Mercedes at a civil servant to help Scott escape down the road. It wasn't only his child support payments he was missing. He was so behind with his property tax payments that he now owed the government $500,000. He couldn't escape the repo men for long. They came for his cars first, taking Scott's Ferrari, the Cadillac Escalade, which he used to drive his entourage around, and his custom Hard Bones bike worth $160,000. But this was far from over. In December that year, Scott was caught hiding rapper DMX in his mansion. The rapper was hiding from police who had a warrant for his arrest. But Scott wasn't worried about that. He had enough of his own problems piling up. He was charged with Grand Theft Auto after he held onto a rented Bentley for months after he was meant to return it. By the time of his arrest for this crime, he'd cost the rental company a whopping $65,000. That doesn't look great. But just 1 month later, Scott avoided the attention he was getting for that by checking into rehab. Almost at the same moment, he also filed for bankruptcy for the first time. I'm guessing he had no choice because more and more people were taking the chance to sue him for insane amounts of cash he'd never paid them. Unfortunately for Scott, his bankruptcy application was dismissed by the courts, and he remained liable for all the money he owed. A jewelry store sued him for $170,000 after they discovered his checks bounced. An electronics company claimed they were owed $22,000 for the surveillance systems they installed at Villa Ferrari. A Parisian artist whose work decorated the walls of Villa Ferrari came forward because Scott had only paid him half of the $300,000 he owed him. And others were coming forward about business contracts that Scott had broken, including a movie producer who sued Scott for $750,000. There was nothing Scott can do to stop them. But before you feel too bad for him, when his mom was sued for $5,700 that she owed on her credit card for food and medical bills, Scott did nothing to help her. He was getting a taste of his own medicine when they foreclosed on Villa Ferrari. In desperation, he even pawned his $20 million yacht on eBay for just $600,000. Even his music royalties were being taken to pay off his debts. He wasn't doing much to help himself. In early 2012, he was arrested in his hotel room. The police had been called by the hotel because Scott had refused to pay his bill. When the police arrived to help, they discovered large amounts of cocaine that was more than enough evidence to allow them to arrest Scott. Just a few months later, another lawsuit came in. This time, it was a young, aspiring singer. She told the courts how Scott had agreed to produce 6 songs of her debut album in exchange for $45,000. She paid him $30,000 of her own cash up front for his help, but when they got into the recording booth, he quickly proved he was on so many drugs he couldn't even produce one song, and he never paid back the money. To add insult to injury, Scott was robbed at gunpoint outside a New York hotel in 2013. He handed over his jewelry and a suitcase. Inside it was about $5,000 in cash. There were more stints in rehab that didn't change the money he owed. For a time, it even looked like he was getting his life back on track. He rekindled his relationship with his older son, and his old manager had slowly helped him get back into the studio. At first, his manager claimed Scott couldn't even compose real music anymore. He was just creating noise. And Scott didn't really know how to record without the cocaine, which used to fuel recording sessions that would run up to 20 hours at a time. But slowly, he started to gain clients again. B-list rappers were taking a chance on him, hoping there was still some gold dust left in Scott. Finally, he headed out to LA to work with one of his first big break clients again, Dr. Dre. He was partnering the iconic rapper on the album Detox, which had been in the works for almost 10 years by that time. It was Scott that produced the album's first single. There's no need to tell you that it was a success. Even better, Scott's son had decided he also wanted to be a music producer like his dad, so Scott allowed him to come stay with him in LA and attend the recordings of Detox in the studio. That's the kind of father-son bonding you only see with good dads, right? But it wasn't smooth sailing. Scott filed for bankruptcy again in 2015, just as every magazine was claiming the producer was getting back on track. At the time, he claimed he only made $10,000 the previous year. This time, the courts accepted his claim. Now, nobody seemed to have clear answers about what Scott's bank balance looks like. Some say it's still a disaster. Others have his net worth as high as $1.5 million. It's impossible to tell who's right, but there's no doubt Scott is trying to revitalize his brand as the biggest producer in the business. That is, if he stays off the drugs. There are also some sources that say he opened his own rehab facility in 2020, which might just prove his commitment to staying clean. If he can pull that off, I'm sure he can also get rich again in the future. Not everyone in the rap industry bounces back though. Sure, some rappers are super smart and even grow their wealth, but others end up broke in the dumbest ways possible. Don't believe me? Then check this out.